Okay, so up to now we've laid out the legal requirements for the organization, the regulatory requirements, we have the acceptable risk level, we've identified our assets, we've calculated our risk, we've got all this information, and we took it to management. Management decided what to do with the risk. And then what's the next step? What do we do now? Well, now we have to build an actual security program, and there's a few different categories that we're going to talk about in building a whole security program. Some people don't know what the term security program really means. Another term for it could be enterprise security architecture. So one of the most important things about your security program is that it's a layered approach. And that means you have several different barriers that somebody has to go through to be able to get to the asset. And it depends upon the sensitivity of that asset, how many barriers there are. So it's a very sensitive data, let's say. You've got physical barrier, you've got firewall, maybe another firewall, you've got access control, encryption. All of these different layers, somebody would actually have to break through to be able to get to your asset. Now, this is a very common concept in security, and one thing that organizations don't do is that they don't do the layered approach around the whole environment, because they'll do the firewall, through the DMZ. You have a couple firewalls and your access control and such, but they don't realize that remote access, whoever's coming through remote access, they don't have enough layers there. Or the wireless network, they don't have enough layers there. So it's not just having enough barriers or enough layers of protection, it's having them in the right place where you're most vulnerable. Now, we certainly don't want any surprises when we're developing our security program, which actually happens a lot. The surprises are when you don't collect enough data. Once you start developing your security program, a lot of things come up. If you don't do your research and find out how the business works, find out where the sensitive data is, find out where the sensitive data travels, the in and out points of your environment. If you don't find all of this stuff out and just start building your security program, you're going to run into things and you're going to start going one way and looking at point solutions. So really the most important thing is that assessment, going through, identifying the risks, and then start building. So you can look at the security program as the foundation for your whole enterprise security architecture. And just like any foundation, it's going to support a lot of different things. And I said earlier that I've seen companies where they do the best they can, but it's hard to build a security program when you don't understand it holistically, because it's not just technical, it's the processes that have to be understood, it's the business issues. So you need to take the time to build it properly, and then if you build it properly, then you don't have to go back and try to fix things. You could build on top of it, and you've got security through the different layers. Now, when companies want to build a security program or they need to secure their environment, a lot of them don't know how to start. And that's where you get into this whole analysis paralysis. You're going into meetings, you're collecting data, and you don't do anything with that data. And that's when you go to point solutions. This whole process is it's easily mapped out, and you should follow it kind of A to Z. And so you understand who the shareholders are of the security program and who's ultimately responsible. You come up with your strategies and your principles of what is our acceptable risk level, what is it we have to protect, and then you develop your security architecture. Now, a lot of people think a security architecture is the technical architecture, but it's not. It's your security architecture is the actual framework that you're going to use, and I talked about like 7799 as a framework, and there's some others out there that are very useful, but you have to figure out which framework are we going to use. Then you come up with your organizational structure, which means who's going to be responsible for what. You have to assign roles and responsibilities. Then you could develop your technical framework, because technology is supposed to enforce what your strategy is, and technology is just one piece that enforces that. Then you come up with your baselines and your standards. You come up with your compliancy, make sure that you're compliant with the policy, the different laws. You come up with assurance. Now, what assurance means is that you know that the security things are working as they're supposed to be working. How are you going to check on that? That's monitoring and auditing. And more companies are developing security metrics. Security metrics are very important because they could track how well your security components are doing, how well your security initiatives are. You know, in the past, a lot of security professionals have had a hard time, or somebody in the organization going to management and say, you know, I need some more money for this. I need, you know, we need to roll out IPS or IDS or whatever. And management would say, well, I just gave you $200,000 last year. Why should I give you some more money? And it's really hard to sell security because it's basically like insurance. If everything goes good, nothing happens. So it's been a hard sell to management when you need funds or you need to build things that they don't fully understand. And that's one benefit of setting up metrics. You can show that when you put a control in, you could actually have metrics to indicate the amount of successful or unsuccessful attacks, the amount of successful or unsuccessful viruses that got in. Another metric is the amount of time, operational time it took for to clean up or to recover, amount of downtime, amount of revenue. So metrics are becoming more and more important and mature in the environment. Now, there is a difference between functional and assurance requirements. Functional process, and most companies, I don't think anybody's fully there yet, but that's our utopia. That's what we're working towards. Now, in the past, security usually came from IT, as I said, and that's a bottom-up approach. And the problem with a bottom-up approach is you have people in IT who they actually don't know all the risks to the company. They understand the technical risks, but they don't understand all of the risks, and they don't understand the full business. They don't have the purse strings. They don't have the recognition. Security needs to come from the top down, because it's senior management that can enforce security standards, can enforce that people will be doing what they're supposed to be doing. They have the money, and they have a larger view of the organization. Instead of just one component like IT, they can understand an organization and all the different types of risk and how it can affect the company. So security needs to come from the top down, because the top is the one that's liable in the end. So I've fought with management over a lot of years, and I'm just thankful that security is now becoming into more people's consciousness, and they have to think about this at different levels. But people who've been in this industry for quite some time know what a struggle it's been to get management to key in and understand these things. Now, I said that there's different models or frameworks that you can use to build a security program, and the most popular one it's called BS 7799. That's British Standard, but now it's been accepted by the industry body, so it's ISO 7799. And if you look at the different things that fall under these guidelines, they map pretty well to the CISSP domains, because within the CISSP domains, we actually go over what needs to take place in every security program. So if most people or organizations aren't going to know how to build a security program, so that's why they laid this out. Like I said, it was British Standard 7799, and it was a de facto standard. De facto just means that it's a good idea, so everybody starts doing it. And then it can move into an actual standard, which this has done. And that's what the ISO, that's International Standards Organization. So this, companies actually get certified against this, and the 7799 is going through some upgrades or being a little bit modified by the ISO group. Now, as if things weren't confusing enough, what you'll usually see when we're looking at this type of thing is ISO I7799, because the British Standard 7799 was actually broken into 3 parts, and the CISSP exam covers really just the first 2 parts. In the British Standard 7799, the first part talks about the controls that could be used, the countermeasures that should be used. And the second part talks about how to actually build a security program using the controls that are in Part 1. So since we're kind of going through this flux, the numbers are actually changing, which are confusing some people. So what you'll commonly see today is ISO 17799 2005, and that means it's a standard, an ISO standard. They're still using the 7799, and 2005 is when it was created. That's for the first part. For the second part, they've already moved away from 7799, and you'll see ISO 27001. And that represents the second part. It gets too confusing. So 7799, it basically had 3 parts. And as ISO is kind of bringing under its wings, it's moving it to its own numbering scheme. And so that's why people are kind of confused with it. So if you see ISO I7799, that deals with the first part. That's the actual controls. If you see ISO 27001, that's the second part. That's how to actually build a security program. Because security is so important, the organization, the ISO organization, is coming up with its whole series. It's very common to like the 9000 series with quality. If you've ever had to go through being compliant with the 9000 series, whole series, a whole bunch of numbers that indicate exactly what needs to take place. So the ISO has come up with a series starting off with 27000 that has a vocabulary of all the terms that it's going to be used in that series. So again, right now what you'll usually see is ISO I7799, which represents the controls that could be used, and then ISO 27001, which represents the security program. Now, it's the security program standard that companies can choose to get certified against. So you can have an outside auditor who's already been blessed, by ISO that they could do this. They'll come in and see if you're actually following the standard and are compliant with it, and then you can brag to your customers to say that somebody else says we're secure. I mean, that's the reason that you actually do it, is provide confidence with your customers and your partners. Now, something else that's getting a lot more limelight is called COBIT. And this is the Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, COBIT. And this is a whole structure for really how to set up a IT infrastructure. It's not necessarily just about security, although it has a portion that deals with security. It's about all the things that should take place in a IT infrastructure. In COBIT, there's 4 domains. It's broken down into planning and organization, acquisition and implementation, delivery and support, and monitoring. So it has all of these different domains, And within security, we're usually just looking at the delivery and support domain that ties into the security issues. Now, COBIT is great, the infrastructure library. And this is not something that's directed at security, even though there's a security component in it. The goal of ITIL is to run the IT department in a very efficient way to perform its services to its customers. And its customers are the internal groups within the company. So ITIL is really about the IT department and making sure that it gets requests and fulfills them properly, and they're very efficient and effective. And there is a component of security in it, but it's something that you should be aware of because it's becoming more and more important because we have to save money. There's a lot of wasted money and wasted time within IT departments, and we have to make sure that they map properly to business processes. Now, security governance is another term that is in the industry, and I feel sorry for a lot of people that they get very confused. In fact, Information Security Magazine asked me to write an article about what is 7799, what is Octave, what is HIPAA, what are all these acronyms that are being thrown around, because companies these days, the business people, not only do they not necessarily understand technology or the security, but they already have their job. They already have a job, and now security is becoming part of their job, and it could be very complex, and they don't necessarily have the time to do all the research and live and breathe security like the professionals. So, another thing is, what is the security governance? This is another term that is very subjective to a lot of people. They don't know how to necessarily articulate it. So security governance is it's like corporate governance. Corporate governance means that the board and senior management is overseeing and responsible that the organization is running properly, that nobody's cooking the books and all that. So security governance is that security is being controlled, and it's being done properly. It's not just in IT. It's a board issue. It's a senior management issue. It's spread out across the different process owners or the business units. So security governance is something that's kind of wishy-washy, where some people don't know what it is, but it's out in the industry being discussed a lot. And I put together an actual article describing security governance, and what I did is, instead of use the common terminology that's used to explain what this is, I give an example. So when you're looking at security governance, you can look at two different companies, and they both have firewalls, they both have access control, they both have a security team, they both have a CISO in place. So it seems like they're both the same. They're doing the same amount of work in security, they're performing the same. But that really is not true. When you look closer, you can have company A that actually has a security governance program, and that means that everybody who is supposed to be involved is involved. The board, senior management, the different process owners. The other company, it's just an IT. They don't have the security spread out, and senior management isn't taking it seriously. Another thing is that the executive in the company A, the executives are setting the stage, they're setting the tone for security. Company B, you have a CISO who has all the responsibility and liability, but no support, no funds. And for a long time, and even today, CISOs are commonly the sacrificial lamb because the senior management isn't taking responsibility. And company A that has security governance, They would understand the business processes. They understand where the security risks are within the business processes. In Company B, they haven't documented or looked at the processes. That's a big difference. In Company A that has security governance, they hold their people accountable. They hold not only the CISO, but the process owners and even the employees. In this other company, they have policies, but they don't ever back them up. So you could see the difference between two different companies. One has security governance and one doesn't. And another thing with security governance is you have the metrics in place and you're continually trying to improve and you're monitoring. So security governance is really becoming a big thing in the industry because regulations are requiring it. And a lot of people don't understand what actually it is. It means doing the right thing, doing all the things that we're talking about, especially in this domain, and being responsible, carrying out due diligence and due care. Now, we've talked about risk management. We've looked at some frameworks that could be used to set up a security program. We talked about what a security program is. Now we have to kind of start filling it in. And in the components, especially in security management practices, would be the development of the policies, the standards, the baseline, the guidelines, roles and responsibilities. So some people aren't actually familiar with the policies. Some people are at a very technical level and they never see the policies and they don't realize how many there really are. Some people think there's just one policy that affects and addresses everything. Most organizations have several different policies that address, specific issues of how you're going to deal with sensitive data or physical security. So there's a lot of different policies usually involved. Now, the overreaching policy is the organizational policy, and that addresses the business needs, the laws, regulations. But this is the directives for management. Basically, the policy is what management says the role of security in this company. What is the role of security in this company? So there's different types of policies, but there is usually one overreaching policy itself. So in this organizational policy, what's there? Well, we have the strategic direction of what security management is all about. We identify the compliancy issues. We define the actual security program itself. You define the roles, not individuals. You don't call out individuals. You define the roles and their responsibilities. You define the actual security team. So in a way, it's a high-level roadmap, but it is very high level. A policy is not specific because it has to cover so many different departments and so many different processes and different technologies. If your policy was specific, let's say about a type of firewall, you'd have to change it once you did a refresh. So a policy is almost like a law. It has to be interpreted. So the organizational or the overall policy works as the framework for the security program. And what that means is it's the directives for management. They've laid out in the policy, it lays out all the things we went over. And this is what you go to when there's a question. After a security program is put in place, if there's ever a question of how to deal with something, or if there's somebody doesn't agree with some of the procedures or standards, you always go back to the policy to see what it says, because the whole thing is you have to be compliant with the policy. That's the whole goal of all the security stuff within an organization. And it has to be a good policy that covers all the responsibilities of security. Now, like I said, there's several different types of policies. There's individual policies that are called issue-specific policies, also called functional policies. And they are going to address specific things that the overall policy can't get into. For example, email is only supposed to be used for business use. You can't use it for personal use. There's no confidential information that can be passed through email, or internet use can only be for business use, what to do in physical emergencies. So there's individual policies that deal with individual specific items. So within every policy, you'll have a purpose of what the policy is, you'll have the scope, what this policy actually covers, and then you'll lay out the requirements. And there's a lot of great templates and policies out there that can be used instead of starting from scratch. So we have organizational policy, we have what does good mean, what does bad mean, what are the ramifications for being bad. So that's why we need much more specific things. So a standard is something that has to be enforced, it has to be followed. And there's a lot of different standards, like employees have to have a badge with their ID, their photo ID always available. Guests can't walk around without being with an employee with them. And then there's standards that deal specifically with technology on what the configurations absolutely have to be. So standards have to be followed. If they're followed, then that means that the policy is being enforced. So within the policy, so within the standard you'll have laid out exactly who does what or what needs to happen. And something that's very common is a configuration standard, and that goes through the exact configurations and the settings, and they're usually pretty large documents that are very detail-oriented. Now, a baseline is, for test purposes, you need to know that a baseline is the minimum level of security required. And what that means is that we have an acceptable risk level set, and let's say within the accounting department, we can only use systems that have a C2 rating. Now, if you're familiar with Orange Book, you know what that means, a C2 rating. We can only process top secret information on mandatory access control systems. So baseline means we have to have at least this much security. Now we can go above this, we could have more security on top of it, but we have to at least have this much. So really, if we follow all the standards, that means that we're hitting that baseline. So if we follow all the standards properly, we are providing the minimum level of security that's required. And then, as I said today, we're getting into metrics to be able to define these and keep track of the security levels a little bit better. Now, there's a lot of products out there that will provide you different metrics, and those are important to understand how well you're doing in reducing the vulnerabilities, reducing your risk overall. And this is outside of CISSP, but what's important is that within your company, you develop standards and metrics that makes sense to your environment. Because a lot of my customers are very concerned about what metrics. They don't know what metrics to come up with, and they say, well, what's used in the industry, or what are companies using? And it really doesn't matter what metrics you're using as long as you stay with them, as long as they're standard across the board, because they have to represent something within your organization, and that's what you're going to report up to management to indicate how well things are going on. But metrics are used to indicate how well we're doing against our baselines. So we set our baselines, the metrics, we keep track of those to say, yep, we're hitting our baseline, or no, we're not hitting our baseline. We need to put another control in place. And then there's guidelines, which are just suggestions on how to deal with different issues. They're not something that has to be followed. They're guidelines or suggestions. Now, there's guidelines in the industry, and some companies develop their own guidelines internally, because you can't have a standard for everything. So maybe a guideline explains what a private key and a public key, how they work and how they work within a PKI. That could be an example. And then you have procedures, which are step-by-step instructions of how to do something. And this is really where most companies fall down, is to have complete sets of procedures. Because there are a lot of writing, there's a lot of stuff to put down. But the reason that you should have procedures is to ensure that things are happening in a standardized way. Would you want somebody to set up a server any way that they want to? Or should they set up a server and have the same configurations as the other servers? So it's all about standardization. So if we look at how these components come together, let's say we have a policy that unauthorized users should not have access to sensitive data. And a policy would be that high level. Then you'd have a standard that says users must have a smart card and a PIN number to be authenticated and then authorized to access this sensitive information. That's the standard. The baseline is the number of unauthorized accesses allowed, because really you can't have 100% security like I've talked about. So you have to set a baseline that's a clipping level. It's an actual threshold. Then you have a guideline that explains what identification and authorization is, and potentially how to use smart cards. And then you have procedures on how to actually configure like a database that controls where the sensitive data is. So this is how they all work together. And again, the policy is the management directives, it's high level, and all of these other things are developed to provide meat for us to actually know what to do to be compliant with the policy. So the policy should not just be known by the security group, and that happens. If you go into an organization, you say, let me see your security policies, some people will never know where they are. Everybody should at least know how to get access to them. They should be on like an internet site or something. But the CEO and the board actually needs to bless them. They need to bless the policies that are put in place. And so we just see how what the relationship is, that standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines come from the security policy and support it. That's the relationship. Now, what's senior management's role in security? We actually talked about this a little bit, because I said that security should be top down, not bottom up. Security management needs to run, they don't do day in, day out operational stuff, but they have to make sure that people are staying on security. They have to make sure it's continually funded as needed, that it doesn't just stall, because a lot of security initiatives start and then aren't completed. It's actually management's responsibility to enforce this, whatever the new security initiative is. And the whole thing about security, the biggest, hardest thing to do is change culture. Implementing technology is the easiest thing to do, but people are really usually the problem. And senior management has to be behind security to help that culture change, so that you can have some type of enforcement on the rules that are being followed. So we need to understand you're actually practicing security the way that you are supposed to. A lot of times you'll have gaps that you want to get fixed, but you don't have the funds, or you don't have the acknowledgement, or nobody's looking at it or paying attention to it. So once auditors come around, they can mark you off on that, and then you can go to management and say, okay, not only do I say that we need to do this, the auditors say that we need to do this. And auditing is becoming a bigger thing because of all the regulations. Most large organizations have internal auditors that are ensuring the compliancy to the policy, and then there's external auditors that will come and make sure the company is compliant with the regulations.